Hello guys, here Gabby again. Today we're going to talk about a little bit about clean architecture and the dependency rule. Um, Most systems do not become hard to change because of business complexity. They become hard to change because everything depends on everything. That's key. Clean architecture exists to fit exactly that. Clean architecture is an approach where the core of the system is protected. That's why it's protected from frameworks, databases, HTTP, infrastructure details. The core of the system is the domain and the use cases. Okay, the most important thing about clean architecture is that the core of the system must be the domain and the use cases. Everything else is secondary. Okay, we protect them from the frameworks, from the HTTP, from the databases, from external providers, from infrastructure details, from other sources. Okay, the clean architecture approach is protect the core. Okay, so we have an important rule that is the dependency rule. Okay, the most important concept in clean architecture is the dependency rule. We talk about a little bit implicitly in the other videos, but the rule is simple. Dependencies always point inwards. Okay, that means outer layers can depend on inner layers, but inner layers never depend on the outer ones. For example, the single rule defines the entire architecture. If we have the API, the application, and the domain, the API can reference infrastructure and application, but not in reverse. The application must not reference the API. If so, it's a circular reference, for example. Okay, it does not have any sense. The API points or reference the application project and or else reference the infrastructure project, and the application layer reference the domain, but the domain that is pure, that is the core of the system of the clean architecture value, depends on nothing. Okay, so um, we have the domain that does not depend on anything, no frameworks, no databases, no infrastructure, nothing. We only could have there entities, value objects, and rules business. And for example, in the upper layer, that is the application has the use cases. The application uses the domain. The application depends on the domain. This is where I define the use cases. Okay, the application orchestrates the business flow, but it still doesn't know how data is stored or which provider is used. So the application is the orchestrator. We orchestrate what we are going to do with the business logic, for example, but we could know what the implementation is. For example, we call n external providers from the infrastructure layer, and we could not know what's going on. We make a payment, and the payment could be done with two different providers, and the result can be a success or not success, and we don't know the implementation. Um, and so no, the application orchestrates only the business flow, nothing more. And on the other hand, as we talked recently, the infrastructure layer is the one that implements most of the technical details. It implements how we are going to store the data in the databases, how we implement the HTTP details. For example, we can use a custom HTTP client, factory, or use a library as Refit, for example. We can use cache as Redis, and so on. The infrastructure plugs into the system by implementing those interfaces defined by the application. So the application could have n abstractions like the contracts of the interfaces, and implementations are done in the infrastructure layer. In the infrastructure layer, we have the n propagations of the behaviors we want: HTTP, Redis, cache, telemetry, and so on. But the contracts that define that limit that, it resides mostly on the, or should be residing on the application layer. And in the upper side of all of the clean architecture that we are talking about, we have the API. The API is like the edge of the system. It receives, for example, the HTTP request. We map it into inputs or commands or queries. Then we execute the use cases and we return the responses. We talk about this in the last video. We could also do the validations of the contracts, of the request, or else, for example, before mapping the input into a DTO that resides on the application side, we can validate. For example, we have a payment request. The payment request must that has n fields. The n fields must respect some rules, and that rules can be that could be validated in the API or the application, but in the API with fluent validation. So let me give you a real example from payments. Okay, in the application we could have define a series of interfaces like I payment gateway, I payment repository, and those were just interfaces. Okay, the infrastructure contained the concrete implementations of both the gateway and the repository. We implement there the database access, the external payment providers, and the application never knew how the payments were executed. As I said before, it only knew what it needed. Okay, now how do I actually model use cases in the application layer? We could use some sort of, for example, vertical slice or a pattern CQRS with a library of MediatR, in which, for example, if any or every use case that we need to implement is very complex or fat or whatever, we cannot have a gigantic service to do that. So we can implement some vertical implementation pattern like CQRS, with command, with queries, and so on, where each use case is represented as a command or a query with its corresponding handler. Okay, those handlers lives in application and represent one business operation. One handler, one business operation, one behavior. For example, in the best use of cases, we could have one endpoint that then calls the application, and the application implements the CQRS with one business operation, and that's all the vertical slice that we are modeling between API, application, domain, and infrastructure. Talking about infrastructure, we could talk about the communication with infrastructure. Okay, the application defines interfaces, also called ports in other ways, for everything it needs. For example, repositories, HTTP gateways, cache access, infrastructure services, and everything is wired together using dependency injection. Okay, why this matters? This result is powerful. The application never knows which database is used, which HTTP client is used, and which provider is behind the scenes. It only depends on abstractions. Okay, that's what gives us the real decoupling, the testability, and the long-term maintainability. So if we have to remember one thing about clean architecture, we have to remember this: the business rules do not care about frameworks. The frameworks are only tools. The business rules are the product. We have to protect them, and they are the core system of our microservices. Okay, so I hope you like this video. If it's useful and you learn something or you are curious about it, I am glad. So thank you again for watching the video. Give a thumbs up, a like, subscribe, and have a good day. Bye bye.